This is the LatinNews Podcast. I am your host, Richard McColl, here in Colombia. This week's very special guest is Dr. John Crabtree, Research Associate at the Latin American Center at the University of Oxford and author of the recently published Mining in the Peruvian State, out and available by Routledge. We're going to be discussing Peru and the recent election. So welcome back, John, on this podcast. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Many thanks. Nice to be back too.
Yeah, no, it's always good. You put things into a very, I would say, digestible manner, the politics of what's
Sometimes
going on.
Digestible facts, but still, yes.
That's it, isn't it? So let's talk about Peru. I think we start with, there's been such a high turnover of presidents. And now, obviously, we have Keiko Fujimori in power 4 times. She's run for president, and now she's finally won. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of a background to where we are.
Yes, this is, as you say, it's the 4th attempt, and she narrowly won. All the previous attempts have also, in 2011, 2016, 2021, were also very narrow. But there seems to be a feature of the Peruvian political system is that it produces very balanced results in terms of the numbers. And this time is certainly no exception. We've been, when the original count was made, it seemed like Roberto Sanchez had won. But when the external tallies from Peruvians living abroad and those tallies that were being questioned or for irregularities were included, the balance went the other way and she won. I think we haven't actually had a final result, but I was looking at them this morning and that the results at 99.99%. As good as it's going to likely to get, shows that there was a difference out of an electorate of about 18 million or 19 million of just under 50,000. It was 50.13 for Fujimori as against 49.87 for Roberto Sanchez. So very close.
And we're talking about sort of razor edge elections. Of course, we've just had the Colombian one, but this is even tighter. And this is incredible. And so Keiko Fujimori is going to be a president-elect. She takes over, I think, on the 28th of July, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. That's the Peruvian Independence Day.
And she'll be a president-elect who will have been voted in by the margin of difference by voters overseas. She will have actually technically lost within Peru.
Yes, that's right. It depends also on the ballots that which were subject to discussion. So it's difficult to actually extrapolate which ones she might have won in the end. Yes, without the voters from Peru, but the number of voters outside Peru is quite substantial in a fairly large chunk of the electorate. So it's a country which has suffered a lot of emigration over the years.
What tipped the scales towards Keiko Fujimori over Roberto Sanchez, the tiny tipping towards Keiko? What has brought her into power then?
I think probably she didn't make it very clear. Her manifesto was fairly, apart from 1 and 2 points, was fairly nondescript. And often the manifestos give you pretty little clue as to what they're actually going to do when they actually reach office. So you have to be a bit careful interpreting. But I think that the main focus of it was looking at the record of her father as president of Peru in the 1990s, which was a time when Peru began being through a period of considerable macroeconomic instability and, of course, a massive amount of violence perpetrated by Sendero Luminoso and the conflict that surrounded that. And in a sense, the Fujimoristas have always portrayed themselves as being the sort of saviors of the nation in that respect. So that's quite a powerful narrative to me. And of course, Peru is going through, like many other Latin American countries, moments of considerable insecurity, criminal problems, which her sort of mano dura line echoed quite well with quite a large proportion of the electorate, particularly in Lima, where sort of problems of urban violence have been particularly marked over the last 12 months or so. So I think that's probably what tipped it. In the first round, she got 17% to Sanchez's 12%. She had perhaps an advantage from the outset in that respect, but both of them had to appeal to. And it's interesting, I think, that Peru, if you add up those two votes of 17 plus 12, you compare that with Colombia, where the two main candidates are having about 80% between them, it tells you something about the level of fragmentation of Peruvian politics. And this raises problems of legitimacy, of course. If you get it on the first round, the only people who voted for you is only 17% of the population. It is questions as to whether ultimately how legitimate the result is seen to be.
This is true. So it really was a vote for the main concerns, security and violence, and then of course the vote in Lima for Keiko Fujimori. Okay, so no one's thinking about the reputation of her father in the past, Alberto Fujimori. It was a pretty big scandal over the years. No one's thinking that doesn't cast a negative shadow over her?
It does. No, this is one of the reasons that the politics has become so divided in Peru. There are certainly large parts of the country where the legacies of Alberto Fujimori loom very large, and they feed into the scale of the vote for Roberto Sanchez, not least in terms of the kind of human rights problems that existed then. And I think she managed to dodge some of the accusations about corruption of her father's government, which you may recall he was jailed for corruption and for human rights crimes. But those tend to be things that feed into the vote for the anti-Fujimori, have done under successive elections. It may be the fact that now we are getting a bit further away from the past of that this is one of the things that may have tilted things in her favor, because there aren't so many people who actually remember what it was like in the 1990s. You've got new voters coming into the system, and that sort of historical memory, which fed into the sort of anti-Fujimorista victories in all the three previous elections, that those memories were perhaps stronger then than they are now.
But I always think that the Peruvian electorate does seem to be rather tolerant. I remember them re-voting in Alan Garcia after all of those scandals, who skipped town and went off to France with some of the state coffers, and then came back and spoke so well and won the elections again for a new election.
Again, it was a sort of more. The system of two rounds tends to produce a sort of anti-vote rather than a pro-vote, and I think that Alan Garcia on the second time round was able rather skillfully to portray his opponent, Ollanta Humala, as being a stooge of Chavez, which to a certain extent was true, because Chavez, the Chavistas, the Venezuelans, helped finance his campaign. And in Peruvian politics, which the Alan Garcia was able to take advantage of.
But then I remember I was there for the protests about the Vladividios, the Vladimiro Montesinos, the spy chief in charge, and the bribery that took place through all of the period of Fujimori.
Yeah.
These were dark times. Everyone was corrupted.
Yeah, and I think now the problem of corruption has been plagued Keiko as well. Keiko is one of the people who received money from dodgy sources and others as part of the Lava Jato scandal back in 2011 and 2016. And that was something that moved, but she's managed to skirt that one, and as she's managed to, through her supporters having a controlling influence in the Congress and over the judiciary, to get it thrown into the long grass. So it's no longer, she's actually been acquitted of those charges rather peculiarly, because the proof is fairly strident.
How fortuitous. I was going to ask, what does the Congress look like when it comes to her mandate? Will she have a mandate, or is it going to be another?
The Congress in Peru has asserted its authority repeatedly since 2016, when one of the systems, originally Peru had a fairly presidentialist system, but it's only presidentialist if the president can actually control Congress. And since 2016, it's been the Fujimoristas that have controlled Congress and their adversaries who have been in the executive. The question of who controls Congress is very important going forward. And to a certain extent now, the boot is on the other foot. If we look at the composition of the Congress, and bearing in mind that for the first time since 1992, we now have a reinstated Senate. So we've got a bicameral system. It's not just one chamber, but two. The elections to the Congress produced a fairly stark divide between almost exactly the same number of seats between the Fujimoristas and their allies in Renovación and Popular, as against everybody else. So the opposition, the right have got 30, and the sort of left of centre parties have got 30 seats of a 60-seat Senate. So it's pretty clearly divided, so long and as Fujimori can count on the support of the people from Renovación Popular. The situation in the Chamber of Deputies is rather different. There, the Fujimoristas and their allies have 56 seats, whereas the sort of left of centre parties have 74. So there's no longer the same degree of control of the executive can expect from the Congress. So in a sense, you say the Fujimoristas have won the presidency after all, but the opposition to a certain extent is fairly well entrenched into the Congress. And of course, how that will work out in practice is anybody's guess. But it's almost fair to say, I think, that a Fujimorista government will use all the incentives it can to swing votes across to support it. And the state is important in that sense in terms of financial incentives or the incentives of public office and so forth. There will be, I think, some attempt to, particularly in the Chamber of Deputies, to use the influence of the executive to buy off and to try and split the opposition. And the opposition isn't. The Peruvian parties are not strong. They are very ill-disciplined. The lessons from the past are that they fracture very easily according to perceived benefits, rewards, and so forth. So, though you may say that there's an opposition majority in the Chamber of Deputies, there are ways and ways of neutralizing that. So, this does, however, push a new government into being slightly more tolerant towards the opposition than the Fujimoristas have ever shown themselves to be in the past. How long this will last, I'm not sure, but we will get a clue when we know who's in the cabinet.
It's true.
That's the first bit of where people get bought off, but various other positions within the state also will be offered here and there to people. And in particular, there's a group which holds the balance in the Chamber of Deputies, which is the group around Jorge Nieto, which is centrist grouping, and I would imagine they would be the sort of first port of call for the Fujimoristas to try and work out some sort of deals with them. They are perhaps less ideological than some of the groups further to the left.
Which suggests that they're easier then to manipulate, less ideological. Yes. And of course, so these are overtures to the opposition, something that, again, we were not expecting the Fujimoristas to do, but it's going to be a necessity this time around.
Yes, the Fujimoristas need in the short run to consolidate their political position. What happens in the slightly longer term, say after a year or so, is anybody's guess. But in the short term, I would think that they would need to look for some sort of, it won't be a pact or anything like that, I don't think, but it'll be looking for arrangements that provide basic stability in terms of support from the Congress towards the initiatives of the executive.
And so looking towards this and looking towards the people who may be named into the cabinet, what kind of thing are we expecting to see for Fujimori's economic policy?
I think this is one of the areas which is a bit clearer than other areas. The manifesto did spell out pretty much what they hoped to do or what they thought they would do if they reached office, and which is it's basically more of the same. This is a sort of fairly status quo policies. They will seek to ensure there's a degree of macroeconomic stability. They will probably adopt relatively conservative monetary and fiscal policies, although they will need to adapt the fiscal policy towards the sort of political strategies to a certain extent. They will certainly defend the autonomy of the central bank. They put a lot of emphasis on the need for private investment as opposed to public investment, but they don't discount public investment, but make very much the argument that the economic future of the country depends on private investment, whether it be domestic private investment or international capital. They make much of the need for what becomes known in Peru as destrave, which is basically deregulation. The Peruvian economy, the Peruvian system is pretty deregulated already. This is the legacy of Fujimori father. It goes back to the 1990s. That hasn't really changed that much. But one of the areas where they really do need to boost foreign investment, is in the mining sector, which you can come back to afterwards if you like. And the other area, I think, which will be important, which will try to reach many of those who voted for it, is a policy of cheap credit towards small and medium enterprises. Much in the discourse of Fujimorismo, much is placed on the notion of small-scale enterprise. And so whether or not this actually materializes, of course, will depend to a certain extent on the fiscal and monetary policies that are adopted. And it's to be expected, I think, that much of this is nothing very new. It's largely a matter of continuity, because really, since the time of the 1990s, Peru's macroeconomic policies haven't changed very much, and they've had ups and downs in terms of success. But at the moment, there is a clear need to boost investment in extractive industries. I mean, as I say, we can come back to talking about the mining sector if you like, but those that I would think, it seems to me, we don't know who the cabinet members will be, but it seems like a very high probability that Luis Carranza will become the return to being Minister of the Economy, Finance and the Economy. He was a former president of the CAF, so he comes with good credentials. He used to work in the IMF. He was also Alan Garcia's second time round Minister of Economy. He comes with a fairly sort of neoliberal agenda, basically, which is sort of music to the ears of foreign investors. And we don't know whether there's been a lot of talk about whether Velarde will continue as the president of the central bank. He's been a sort of fixture now there for 20 years and become a kind of symbol of attitude, if you like, in the sort of economic sense. Carranza's outlook, it dovetails pretty much with what I've said about the priorities. It dovetails pretty much with the Fuerza Popular manifesto on economic policy. So I don't see there's going to be any major shifts. And I think that this will be a discourse which will privilege the idea that private investment will stimulate growth, which has been not very dynamic in the last 2 or 3 years. And growth, of course, will stimulate employment, and this will have trickle-down effects. Now, there are a lot of critics as to whether or not how much trickles down and to whom it trickles down. But anyway, I think that is the sort of central message of the narrative, if you like, of which accompanies the Fuerza Popular into office.
Yeah. Because you're on it and because it's fresh and you have the book, tell us about the mining industry and what we can expect. Obviously, as you said, it needs an injection of foreign investment, but this is likely to happen. There's this, is it a hunger for the Peruvian copper and other minerals that China wants, all of the other investments, or what are we looking at with the mining industry?
The mining industry, whether you like it or not, is likely to be very important going forward in terms of the energy transition. Peruvian minerals will be much in demand, copper in particular, but also if they manage to start producing lithium and other rare earths required, Peru stands to gain from that. Now, looking back over the last 10 years or so, the level of new investment has been relatively modest in Peru. There have been some new mines opening up, but not that many. There's a large sort of pipeline of projects, but the investments haven't been forthcoming in the way which the Ministry of Mines would have liked. Now, of course, prices of minerals are very high, we all know, gold in particular, but also copper and other things too. And we all know also from looking at the global patterns of supply and demand for these minerals that particularly copper, there is a problem of demand outstretching supply going forward. So it seems reasonable to believe that prices will be high for the forthcoming future. And of course, it's the expectation of high prices which determines investment. Not the only thing, but it's without that sort of trend, it's unlikely there will be investment. And the level of investment, as I say, over the past few years has been a bit disappointing, partly, I think, because of political instability. Peru is a country that's gone through 9 presidents in a decade, and that does have its impact. Also, not only the presidents, but also if you look at the ministers of economy, the ministers of mines, and all the rest of them, they don't last more than about a few months on average. And what mining companies are looking for are reasonable guarantees of stability. Of course, mining companies are used to calculating risks, And if the rewards are high, which they look as though they will be, their appetite for risk is probably higher than it otherwise would be. But it seems to me fairly logical to think that there will be some important investments coming to fruition over the next 10, 15 years or so. Peru has used to be the world's second largest producer of copper. It's slipped back to being third, been overtaken by the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Whether or not it can recover its position as the second largest I don't know, but not at the rate at which the investment patterns have been taking place in recent times. And for many, places like the Congo is a cheaper place to be doing business than in Chile or in Peru. So the perspectives for the economy, for the mining economy, are pretty good, I would say. And the question, I think, which we try and analyze in the book, is to whether or not, looking forward over the next 5 years to 2050, whether any of the lessons that have been learned, how many of the lessons have been learned domestically for the last 25 years, beginning with just over 25 years ago that we had the first kind of big upsurge of neighborhood opposition to mining projects in Tambo Grande in Piura. And there have been several others which have also clouded the investment climate to a certain degree, because there have been issues and the management of mining projects has not been without its difficulties, to put it mildly.
When you think of these Andean regions, maybe, again, if you look at Piura, that's up in the north, but then if you think of down in the south as well, is it likely to be a protest movement led by the opposition and Roberto Sanchez? He has been making noises in that he's saying that he will mobilize his supporters and so on. Can we expect some sort of instability surrounding this?
I think the mobilization, to a certain degree, is related to problems around mining, but it also relates to problems about regional development as well, more broadly. And it's no accident that the areas where he won by handsome margins are precisely those areas which have received probably least from terms of the patterns of development over the last 30 years or so. In places like Puno, for example, in the south, he won by 80%. So there was a clear rejection. There are specific reasons why that was, which should go back to human rights problems under the previous administration that help explain that. But it goes wider than simply about mining. Now, one of the areas, of course, which is contentious, highly contentious in Peru at the moment, is the scale of informal mining and illegal mining. And I think it's fairly clear from the figures one has, is that illegal mine or informal stroke illegal miners are not one and the same. So I don't want to confuse the two, but they are voted massively for Sanchez as opposed to Keiko. And of course, they have become a significant proportion of the electorate. It's reckoned that there are maybe, in terms of numbers of families and so forth, there may be more or less more than 1 million people who depend one way or another on illegal mining or informal mining. And the number has gone up and up as the price of gold has gone up and up. And for many people on scant incomes in low-income parts of the country, informal mining represents a lifeline. I've done interviews with people within small-scale miners in places like Arequipa, and this becomes a way in which people can begin to think about become upwardly mobile. I met one leader of a peasant community in Arequipa, who managed to put his kids through higher education in Spain. This is a thing that doesn't happen. It struck me very strongly that people are using it. It becomes a resource to change people's economic trajectory. And of course, as we all know, mineral prices can be high, but they can also go down. It's a question for them of making straw while the sun shines.
And so I think this is a moment to talk about Keiko Fujimori has won. Obviously, this falls into line behind the US doctrine towards Latin America and the right-wing swing that so many are talking about. Where does this leave the Peruvians wedged between, let's say, you say, the US government under Trump and, of course, investment from China. There is a tug of war going on.
Yes, I think the elections were interesting in as much as there weren't many signs of direct involvement of the US administration in terms of trying to influence the result, in comparison maybe with the case of Colombia or other parts in Central America in various instances. I think they realized that intervention on these issues would be counterproductive and that it would simply swing votes in favor of Sanchez if they were to come out saying, vote for Keiko. So I think they were quite cautious. Clearly, a Keiko government will be preferable in Washington to a Sanchez government, without a doubt. And the United States will use its influence to try and draw Peru a bit closer to its own interests. Now, of course, the problem here lies in the fact that in as much as within the polarized global world divided between the United States and China, Peru is one of the economies of Latin America which is most dependent on China. China is the main customer for its mineral exports, not the United States. And it's also a key investor in extractive industries, but many other things as well. And of course, one of the issues that has the potential to become a sort of flare-up between Peru and the United States is the port of Chancay. The port of Chancay, as you may know, is a port which has been built and developed and owned by Chinese companies, and of course indirectly by the Chinese state to a certain extent. And the United States has drawn attention to the fact that Chancay might have military uses as well as commercial ones. Now, the Peruvians have vehemently denied that to be the case, and the Chinese ditto. But this has become an issue in recent times, and particularly by members of the US Armed Forces. So this is potentially a tricky one for any Peruvian government to manage, on the one hand, your dependence on China, but on the other hand, trying to maintain good relations with the United States. It's probably more difficult. It's also a problem that probably faces caste in Chile as well, to a certain. But this is likely to be an issue which could become a difficult one for a Fujimori government if the United States tries to push too hard on the government to sever its links with China, which it simply can't afford to do.
I did find it, as you mentioned, I did find it absolutely fascinating that it was clearly silent approval for Keiko Fujimori from the US government, but without openly saying anything like they did in Colombia or in Honduras. But you knew it was there.
Yes.
You knew that kind of, and that's what was so interesting. And I think it was Bernie Moreno, the senator from Ohio, who was down. He was in Colombia, but he was also in Bolivia, and he was in elsewhere. But this was a hat tip to the region that this was needed, that they were supporting this. It was very interesting that Peru should be the outlier. And as you said, very nationalistic politics. If the US had got involved, then it would have swung probably the vote towards Roberto Sanchez. So someone in the White House knows what's going on in Peru, because that was a very sage advice.
Yes, yeah. So I think this is, as I said, it's a potentially a tricky issue, one which Fujimori will seek to maintain close ties with Washington. Whether or not she joins the grouping around, probably will, I suspect, of that sort of the grouping of Trump-supporting presidents around issues of security and drug trafficking. Of course, bear in mind that Peru is the second, after Colombia, the second source of cocaine, which is something that we're not hear quite so much about in Peru as you do in Colombia or Bolivia, where the United States tends to get more exercised about. They try to keep Peru a bit off the map on that one, but there will be, I suspect, closer military collaboration. Whether or not this would lead to the installation of US bases on Peruvian soil, that again would be a tricky one, I think, because as you note, there is a kind of nationalistic back reactions to the presence of foreign troops on Peruvian soil. And this goes back, as you say, there's a strong nationalistic streak which goes back to the 1960s and 70s.
There's one thing I can see. I could imagine Keiko Fujimori presenting the presence of, let's say, US advisors as a security measure, as in trying to appeal to her voters and placate maybe people in more unstable regions. I could see that coming together under the sort of, again, this big umbrella of the shield of the Americas, but nothing too open, like saying, no, we have invited them down, sort of thing. I could see a very political discourse around it.
Yes. The other issue, of course, here is, that I think is an area of policy which is going to be much more difficult, really fraught with difficulties, is what to do about beefing up security, public security in Peru, because the level of illegal operations of one kind or another, and they vary enormously in terms of scale and in terms of the sectors involved, that there is an illegal economy which is burgeoning in Peru. We've talked a bit about the scale of drug trafficking, drug cultivation and drug trafficking, but this is closely related also to the trafficking of illegal mining and illegal gold, which becomes a way of laundering the profits of drugs. So the two things are tightly interwoven. And quite what Peru can actually do beyond declaring states of emergency, which has been the sort of typical reaction up to now. If you've got a problem and you get accused of not doing very much, you create a state of emergency, which enables the troops to be brought in and one thing, and a few civil liberties to be. But it doesn't actually it isn't very efficacious in terms of its ability to clamp down on these things. And Peru is not El Salvador in this sense. Everybody invokes Bukele, but it's a lot harder in a country where the writ of the state doesn't run very far than is the case in a small country like El Salvador. And even where you would have thought that state presence in Lima would have been, the recent past has shown very clearly that the ability to actually have a policy that is actually successful in terms of reducing levels of urban crime, and much of it is petty crime. We're not talking about major industrial scale crime, but this is the crime that actually matters to most people. This has proved extraordinarily difficult, and whether or not simply building more jails and giving greater powers to the armed forces is not necessarily the answer to this problem. What the answer is another matter, but one of the problems, of course, that adds to this difficulty is the penetration of organized crime into the police force. And the police force suffers from problems which are long-standing. It's not very new, but they go back a long way in terms of the extent to which, and also to a certain extent true of the armed forces, to which criminal organizations are able to penetrate these forces by virtue of the amount of money that's being thrown around.
Yes. I've been reading a lot about extortion and, of course, the proposal as well to militarize the prisons. So, again, this sounds a bit nebulous, though, isn't it?
But it doesn't. Peru needs more prisons, that's for sure. If you've got the problem of overcrowding in Peruvian prisons is horrendous. So maybe a program of building more prisons would be something that's welcome, but it doesn't in itself solve the problem it's trying to solve, it seems to me. And for many people, the discourse, the narrative around, well, what do you do with these people? You simply throw them in jail and throw away the key. That doesn't. The problem goes on, and new people replace the people who are in jail, and I don't know what the answer is here, but some sort of efficacious police reform, at very least, is something that needs to be done.
And finally, I guess we should wind down, but talking about the issue of human rights. You did mention human rights when we thought about Puno. And of course, I guess that was under Dina Boluarte and her presidency. What can we expect how Keiko Fujimori might address the issue of human rights?
If she adopts fairly authoritarian postures, which many people think she will, this evidently has impacts on terms of human rights. Peru has a negative human rights record, and relatively recently, what happened in Puno and the south of Peru at the time when Pedro Castillo was impeached is something that had a quite destabilizing impact, and one of the reasons why people in Puno voted so solidly against Keiko Fujimori, because the Fujimoristas are perceived whether rightly or wrongly, to be amongst those who have been responsible for human rights violations over the years. And of course, it happens to be the case that just last week, the Congress dominated a Fujimorista proposal that was supported by the hard right and pushed through the Congress with lightning speed, is a new law, which I'm not sure whether the present president has promulgated it or not, which forces all members of the police force and the military going forward will not be able to face trials in civilian courts for crimes committed during the course of their actions. And this, of course, as many people see it, is an invitation to impunity, because the way in which military justice works tends to protect members of the armed forces against the kind of accusations to which they are put. And this goes back again, this kind of defensive attitudes of the armed forces goes back to the kind of post-Fujimori, post-Alberto Fujimori period, when the human rights issues, and they were held to account to a certain extent. Senior members of the armed forces were jailed for crimes committed during the course of their actions. So many weren't, but there were cases, and this has been an ongoing thing, and I think that the Congress has, under the Fujimorista leadership in recent times, has done its best to try to satisfy the concern within the armed forces that they are being held criminally responsible for the jobs that they are being asked to do. And you may say that's quite reasonable, that they should have a degree of, that they are being asked to do a difficult job, and that sometimes there are excesses. But it goes back to all the debates that came from the period of conflict with Sendero Luminoso. And the shadow of Sendero is a long one, a very long one in Peruvian politics. Will continue to be, I think.
Definitely. You can imagine Keiko invoking that shadow, but under different guises, of course, to maintain security. You can imagine it, not the Sendero per se, but organized crime of the modern day. These candidates, they require this universal hate figure.
Yeah. This, I think, is one of the more tricky areas going forward. I think that there will be the danger of the human rights community, if you like. It's already been put under a lot of pressure. There are organizations like the Instituto de Defensa Legal, which has been playing a very important role, of the Coordinador Nacional de Derechos Humanos, played a very important role in defending human rights historically. These are organizations which are in the firing line, so far as some people are concerned, within the ranks of Fujimorismo.
As we close this down, John, how about an overview then? Are you positive towards the outlook to Peru then in these coming months, or are you a little bit of trepidation towards a presidency under Keiko Fujimori?
I think it depends a bit on so far as the economy is concerned. I think that probably growth will pick up. So I think that's positive. You can't get Peru still has a major problem with poverty. A substantial proportion of the population are either in poverty or on the verge of it. So growth is important in terms of, if the Fujimoristas are able to pursue their economic policies successfully, this will give scope for programs to try to reduce poverty. And I think, to give Alan Garcia credit for his second administration, he managed to do that. Peruvian poverty rates came down abruptly when growth was very high. Now, Fujimori has promised that by the end of her 5 years, Peru will be growing by an annual rate of growth of over 6%. I will see about that. This may or may not be the case. But so on that level, I think that there are positives, but I do have certain concerns with respect to things like human rights and the future of a more democratic Peru, one which is a more tolerant Peru. I feel that there is a possibility of growing intolerance, of growing regional strife. Now, I may be wrong here, but maybe the Fujimori government will have the sense to try to put the priority on meeting some of the criticisms to which it's been subject in the past. I hope so, but there's no guarantees that's the case.
Let me take this moment. This is a good place to bring this to a close and say thank you so much to Dr. John Crabtree, who is the research associate at the Latin American Center at Oxford University and author of the recently published Mining and the Peruvian State, published by Routledge. So thank you so much for your time and for coming back on the LatinNews Podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks very much for inviting me.
You're most welcome. The pleasure, of course, has been ours. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time discussing further issues from the region. Remember that you can subscribe to the LatinNews Podcast wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and beyond. I've been Richard McColl here in Colombia, and goodbye.